Hello, everyone. Today, I bring to you a dialogue with India's leading environmentalist, Ashish Kothari. Ashish founded his first NGO, Kalpavriksh, when he was in high school. 4 decades later, today, he engages with NGOs around the world and in India and with the government to co-create policies that preserve the environment. He's a co-founder of a global network called Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Today, we'll speak about the state of the environment in India and globally. We'll look at the history, the present, and his vision for the future. So over to Ashish. So, hello, Ashish. It's good to meet you. So, I just want to get started saying, what is the state of environment today in India?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Uday, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and having this conversation. Well, in one word, to answer your question, grim. But to sort of elaborate that, we've seen for many decades actually, and maybe even since the colonial times, we've seen a pretty massive attack on the environment. Colonial times, especially with things like commercial forestry, which was amongst the first times that forests were seen not as a livelihood resource, not as places for nature, but actually for commerce. And the British, of course, had their own interests behind that. But then also post-independence, when we should have known better, we see also again massive attacks on the natural ecosystems of the country in the name of development, large-scale infrastructure development, industrialization, relocation of people, and so on. And this has, but there was still, I think, from the 1970s onwards, there was also a growing ecological awareness emerging from people's movements on the ground, like the fisher community movements, Chipko, of course, very well known, the movement for saving forests in the Himalaya, and many others, anti-dam movements. And so this was actually beginning to already raise a sort of a consciousness amongst both the urban and the rural populations. For the rural populations, it was about livelihoods. They were not talking environment, but obviously this is seamlessly integrated in their lives. For the urban populations, it was also ecological concerns, the protection of nature and things like that. And this is where we see, because of the people's movements and some interest within the government, you actually started seeing policy shifts in the 1970s onwards. Many of the laws that we have now, in fact, date from that time, or the policies date from that time. The creation of a department and then a ministry of for the environment in the central government, and so on. So this was the time we were growing up. And I was kind of growing up in school, and already in high school, we had become active on environmental issues. And so it was a period of hope, because you were seeing that the kinds of losses we saw since independence, there was some attempt at trying to reverse them, to put ecological issues into decision making and planning. But then 1990, 91 onwards, when we see the introduction of the new economic policies, the so-called structural adjustments and economic reforms, and much more of a integration of India's economy into globalization, that there is actually then a renewed attack on the environment. And you begin to see that even the laws that came in, or the policies came in earlier, were either sidelined or slowly sort of weakened after that, in the decades following that. A colleague and I, Asim Srivastava and I, have a book detailing the ecological and social and economic impacts of globalization from 1991 to 2012, and we go into great detail on what's happening. I don't want to go on and on about this, but we've seen this, and then over the last few years, especially in the current regime, this has become even worse, where existing laws are systematically being whittled down, not just bypassed, but actually just being, amendments coming in and things like that. So it's a very blatant and very open attack on the environment. I mean, there's a lot of statistics I don't want to go into, but basically we're seeing very serious impacts on wildlife. Possibly something like 10 to 15% of wildlife species severely threatened with extinction. We're seeing a rapid decline in forests, though the official statistics say that forest cover is increasing. That's because they're actually showing things like plantations and tea plantations and stuff like that as forests, whereas actually the really good thick sort of density forests are being cut down. We're seeing incredible amounts of pollution. There's evidence of now more than 1 million people being killed by air pollution in our cities. Delhi has been in the news forever for being amongst the most polluted cities in the world. River pollution, water pollution, very, very serious, despite thousands of crores of rupees being spent. And now, adding to all of this, the climate crisis, which is not coming in the future, it's already here for millions and millions of people. Whenever I travel anywhere in the country, actually farmers, fishing communities, local communities, potters, people are saying things have changed. We can't grow as much as we used to. We can't grow in the same seasons. The rains have changed. It's much hotter. It's much colder. Whatever. There's very dramatic changes taking place with very severe consequences on people's lives and livelihoods. So yeah, I mean, it's grim.
So I want to take one historical perspective, and then I'll come to a post-independence perspective. Taking a long-term historical view, India has existed for thousands of years. We had Mughal rule for maybe 700 years, British rule for 200 years. What was the state of environment during those eras? Because now we have like this generalized notion amongst all political groups that like we put a benchmark from independence onwards, and then of course now these days it's like Nehruvian economy and onwards. But like taking a long-term view, what was the state of the environment in ancient India, Mughal India, and British India?
Well, I mean, I think from whatever I've read, and it's not that much, but people who've tried to piece together some kind of an ecological history of India, of the Indian subcontinent, say that amongst the earliest incursions into the natural ecosystems would have been when Adivasis, indigenous peoples, were sort of pushed further into the forests by settlers, farming settlers and others. We won't get into the sort of controversies about who came in first and who came in last and whatever, but this is a historical fact that is well known. And so that was probably amongst the earliest, where then forests were cleared for agriculture and Adivasis pushed further in. So they actually also had to then, just for survival, actually also be ecologically more damaging. So that would be 1,000, 2,000 years back, maybe even older. But obviously the scale was not so great. We're talking about patches of India where this kind of thing was happening. During the and for most of the period, whether it's pre-Mughal, pre-Islamic rule, Mughal rule, etc., up till the colonial period, I would say that there would be these kinds of smaller scale incursions and ecological damages taking place. Some amount of, for instance, hunting by the princes, things like that. But for the large part, local communities were actually still managing their ecosystems. On the paper, the land would belong to the king or whoever, but actually the local management was by the communities, and they had built up very sophisticated systems of how to govern, how to manage, rules, customary rules of using the commons, etc. And not everything was perfect, but I'm just saying that that's a general scenario that we see. When the colonial rule when British took over India, a number of things changed. The forests, for instance, where most of the forests of the country, except for patches in northeast India and some in central India, were brought under a central department control. And ostensibly, this was to manage the forests better. But we know, as I said in the previous response, that was actually to gain access to forests for commercial forestry and things like that. Wood that Britain needed back home, or which was needed for its own expansion, like railways expansion in India. So you see that with something like forest, that would be the first much bigger large-scale impact much, much bigger than what would have preceded that for thousands of years. But the other thing that happened also was land laws. The land laws changed. The rules, the governance of lands also changed, right? So much greater rent on peasants and things like that, and that also creates an ecological impact of its own kind. People having to overuse the land just to be able to pay the rent. People having to encroach further into forests so that they have more land which they can then pay the rent for, or whatever, just to be able to survive, right? So these are just two things I'm talking about, but there are others. So even, for instance, amongst the earliest dam building in the country would have been in the colonial period. The idea that you could actually build large structures on rivers and create electricity or irrigation would also have been around that time. So these are some of the sort of pre-independence trends that we have seen. And as I said earlier, even post.
Did industrial revolution have any impact on ecology?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for instance, like I said, the destruction of the commercial forestry was because of the demand for wood in industrializing Britain or Europe. Yeah. So certainly of that kind, the entry of certain kinds of industries, large scale steel production, for instance, and things like that would have also had their own impacts, both on natural ecosystems, but also on Adivasis, indigenous peoples, and other communities who were living in them, because they would then be displaced in order to get hold of those lands or those forests. And I was just making one last point here, which I think is very important, is that we have that pre-colonial period, we have the colonial period. What we saw post-colonial, post-independence, is in some ways a continuation of the colonial governance of natural ecosystems in nature, especially forests, like continuation of the forests, a centralized forest department, which went on until very recently. It's still there, but now at least there's a counter pressure for communities to be able to reclaim rights on forests through the Forest Rights Act, but we can come back to that later.
So, and the reason I went into this also is because since you are involved in public policy, influencing public policies, I'm trying to like put some kind of references on how public policies have influenced our ecosystem. So one point I had to ask was, Gandhiji had a huge influence on India's imagination. Nehru and Gandhi had different kinds of visions of India. Nehru's vision definitely prevailed. He was around for a longer time. Gandhi was assassinated. How much did Nehru's vision of development, and this is not getting personal, but this is more in terms of public policy, how much did it affect the ecological balance or the ecology of India versus the policies followed later, post-Nehru period?
So I think in a way, the Nehruvian period laid the foundations for the notion that development, economic progress, etc., can happen at the expense of the environment, and that's okay. Yeah, I mean, though Nehru himself was ecologically conscious, and of course there would be some Gandhian influence and things like that. Nehru's daughter was, of course, also ecologically conscious, and so the whole, we have that in the family. But there was he had basically bought into the whole idea of Western modern economic industrialization based development, economic growth as a paradigm for development, and so on. So that lays the foundation for what we are seeing now, right? What we're seeing now, and as I said earlier, is a much bigger attack than what happened then. But nevertheless, in a sense, the sort of ideological foundation of how environment is treated as part of development policy, or not seen as central to development policy, comes from that era. So therefore you see a lot of the big dams or the heavy large scale industrialization, even moving away from the Gandhian idea of focusing on villages, right? That was one of the big sort of tensions between them. Gandhi was saying, let the Congress party disband and actually spread across all of India's villages and help the villages to for Sarvodaya and whatever. Nehru had different ideas, and so in that sense also then there was a shift to thinking of urbanization as being good, as cities, as in more and more larger cities being good. And so that's had its own very severe consequences on the environment, because you can't have a huge cities which do not have a massive impact, maybe 1,000 kilometers away somewhere. So yeah.
So to that, I want to reference
stayed.
back to, you talked about land ownership. So there are two events happened in the history of India. One was Vinobaji's Bhudan movement, and the communists in Bengal did land redistribution. These two events, did they have any impact on ecology?
Well, the Bhutan movement was, I mean, as from whatever I understand, it wasn't so, barring a few pockets in India, it really wasn't so large scale. So I don't think there would be any significant impact on the natural ecosystems. The land redistribution in some parts of India, including West Bengal, where it came at the expense of natural ecosystems, and this could be forest, but it could also be scrub areas, it could be grasslands, etc. Many parts of India, grasslands were actually the ones that were given over to poor or landless people as a social welfare measure. Or for land distribution, but ignoring the fact that grasslands are in fact as important in ecosystem as forests or rivers or wetlands or whatever. And in fact, now we're realizing that, because grasslands are actually the best absorbers of carbon. So, so where land distribution actually happened at the cost of what was considered wastelands, but actually were not wastelands, there would certainly have been a serious ecological impact. But of course, land reforms also failed in many parts of India. So I guess in those areas we didn't have, I mean, you would have an indirect impact, because then the poor would be desperate to be able to survive, and they would encroach, maybe further illegally encroach on lands.
I get it. So before I come to the current scenario, I want to go broader and ask you, has anyone anywhere in the world actually at a public policy level and at a mass scale impact level been able to reverse this trend, impact of like big thinking, capitalism, industrialization, all of these things that work against ecology? Is there any nation or any community that has actually reversed the process?
Communities, at community scale, yes, but at a national scale, I can't think of. Maybe Cuba, but again, it depends on which sector you look at. So if you look at agriculture, definitely, from whatever again I've read, Cuba was able to reverse or reject the commodified, commercial, large-scale, chemical-based agriculture that has spread across the world, and create its own much more sustainable form of agriculture. Costa Rica has had some very interesting movements on how the economy and livelihoods could be generated without ecological damage. Neither of these is perfect. I mean, there are lots and lots of problems, of course, in both of these. And then if you look at it more holistically, you'll find that there are other sorts of issues in these countries. But in individual sectors or in certain aspects, yes, they were able to either reject outright, right from the beginning, or reverse what were negative trends. Bhutan is another interesting example, which is the only country in the world that does not use economic growth, GDP, as a measure of development. It uses something called gross national happiness, and it has a fairly sort of interesting system by which, many criteria by which to judge whether a proposed development project should or should not go ahead, not based on whether it will add to GDP and or employment, etc., but a whole bunch of things, including social relationships, levels of satisfaction, etc. But unfortunately, I mean, Bhutan is not really. I mean, that model is not really easy to kind of replicate elsewhere, because it's a small country. there's a certain amount of control that the royalty has. Yeah, so but it's still worth looking at as a possibility of alternatives to GDP. And in fact, now there are 5 countries in the world, all global north countries, New Zealand, Scotland, 2, 3 others, who have international partnership on well-being indicators. So trying to see how they can also move their economies away from this focus on economic growth and GDP into things like, qualitative factors, satisfaction, well-being, clean air, clean water, things like that.
So one of my hypothesis is, and this comes from my own curiosity through my lens of design training and design research training, has evolved where I feel any change in the material world, in the material environment, that is caused by human interface with the environment is a product of human imagination. Because how we imagine and what we believe and the values we hold dear to heart has an impact on how we interface with each other and with the environment. And in order to affect the material world or the political system, one must affect the social imagination. That's my hypothesis. And which means affecting social imagination, which is the art of possibilities, means affecting how people relate to their own self-identity and their relationship with the universe. And so that being that, with that lens, I'm going to ask you the next question. For a young person who is like, think of yourself as the person who was in high school, started your Kalpavriksh, right? That's your organization you started that time.
Yes, yes.
So think of a person of that age group, 1 or 2 generations from now. What kind of imagination and self-image do you want to incubate in them that will lead to they taking responsibility for decisions and actions that actually help nurture the ecology rather than hurt it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting exercise. We actually, just to take a slight detour here, one of the books that colleague Joy, KJ Joy, and I co-edited a few years back, called Alternative Futures, India Unshackled. The book has 40 people writing about what India could look like in 2100, sort of ideal utopian visions, and then come back to now and say, okay, how do we get there? But the last chapter in that, which we co-wrote, Joy and I, is a woman speaking in 2100 and looking back at the last 100 years of transformations across South Asia, and how we went from the edge of precipice, ecological, social, cultural precipice, to a much more just and progressive and sustainable world. So in that sense, I mean, so I'm mentioning this because there's already glimpses of what an individual or a community could think of itself, say in 2100, or let's say in 2040 or 2050, when those transitions are taking place. So if you say that, okay, a young person in high school, a generation or 2 from now, what could that person be dreaming or thinking or doing, right? Which then builds into this kind of an ecological social imagination. I think there's a number of things. To me, a person of that age in that generation would first of all not be going into a closed classroom where nature and everything else is kept out, and I'm basically just learning from textbooks and from my teachers, but would actually be in the outdoors as much as possible, learning from the sorts of environments which I can see at the back of your screen, for instance, and learning from community, not just a PhD teacher, who's been positioned there, but actually saying, okay, who are the elders in this community, or who are the people in this community who've done some fantastic things, who are innovating, who may or may not know how to they may not talk Marx or Foucault or Gandhi or whatever, but they are as wise as anybody else, because they know the land, they know the seeds, they know the animals, they can speak to the earth, they have poetry in their work, and and that would then be a child who would say, well, I'm also an artist. I don't, the conventional notions of what is art are not for me. For me, being an artist is actually being with nature and with other people and creating things. And everybody can be creative in so many different ways, right? It's a child who is able to say, or a young person who's able to say that I actually, because I'm enjoying my work, I'm not separating my work from my leisure. It's not like I don't want to grow up and be somebody going to an office 9 to 5 p.m. and then have fun in the evening and wait for the weekend and earn enough money so that I have a vacation in the Bahamas, etc. But to say I'm enjoying my work so much, doesn't matter if I do it at 9 in the morning or 10 in the night or whatever, it's and I'm doing multiple different things at the same time. I'm not thinking of myself as only a writer or only a farmer or only a critic or something like that, but actually multiple things, right? So I'm becoming. So I think, and also one last thing is that I am able to, and I want to do this, and I'm able to do all of this because I'm part of us. That us being a sense of collective, a sense of community, a sense of, Ubuntu, the Southern African philosophy, that I am because we are, not I think therefore I am, which is sort of Western kind of thing, right? Which is very individualistic. Here they're saying it's the collective that has made me, and I therefore owe a responsibility to the collective. Even as I assert my individuality, I'm responsible for the collective, and that collective is not just other people around me, but all of nature. So for me, that would be.
This is, I really appreciate your elaboration of that imagination. So that takes me to another question. As you can see, I'm using my designerly curiosity to create this our collaborative co-imagination. So my next one is, you have this a loose initiative. I'm not loose, I would call it in an initiative, not, I wouldn't call it an organization, called Global Tapestry of Alternatives. And I love the metaphor of tapestry, because everyone is putting their own thread into weaving this tapestry, to creating this fabric, new fabric. And no one thread has the view or the control over the entire fabric. Now, borrowing from that metaphor, my question is, this is a global initiative. Everybody is bringing their wisdom, their experience, their successes and their failures into this tapestry. Can you give me an overview of what is working that they're bringing into building of this fabric in different parts of the world? You did tell me that there isn't one nation that has successfully reversed the decline of ecology or ecosystem. But what are those threads that give you the hope that the tapestry is going to look good in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, they actually, when I said no nation, I was particularly talking about countries. And one of the problems, I think, with our imagination and with our political and social system is that we have got stuck on the nation state. We think that it is the nation state which should be taking decisions, and the intense international competition with globalization, the inability to deal with things like the climate crisis, to my mind, is at least partly based on this, on the nation state as the primary focus of decision making. That's a huge mistake. It's not that old, okay, maybe a couple of 100 years old or whatever it is, but it has divided natural flows, it has divided cultural flows all across the world,
And
especially the colonial
also just to
colonized.
add to it, it has created the growth of military industrial complex.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So from the colonization time to the creation of the nation states, you actually see the biggest ecological and social impacts all over the world. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because for us at the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, or here in India, we have a national process called Vikalp Sangam, the confluence of alternatives. It's very important to recognize that the peoples of the world are a different entity. We cannot talk about the peoples of the world as if they're Indian or Chinese or American or whatever. They have their own identities. They've had those for much longer than the nation states. And it is at that scale and that level, they're actually seeing the most incredible examples of trying to achieve equality, justice, sustainability, living with the earth, and all of that. We have documented now hundreds of examples, thousands actually across the world. So what we're trying to do is to say, each one of them on their own is weak. It's like a thread, right? Any single thread is weak. When you start putting them together and then weave a basket or a tapestry or a godadi, as we call it here, it becomes much stronger. That's what we need, because if we want to tackle the structures of unsustainability and inequality and oppression, whether it's capitalism or state domination or patriarchy or racism or whatever, the military industrial complex, as you mentioned, the only way to do it is for us to actually also become strong, but to become strong not through the same hierarchical single organizational homogeneous monocultural mindsets that are there in the dominant systems, but through sustaining diversity, recognizing uniqueness, recognizing, as the Zapatista movement in Mexico says, many worlds within a world, a pluriverse, as we've said in one of the latest book that we did, not a universe, but a pluriverse, and then connecting them through these threads and making that sort of strength and that scale happen, or what I also call outscaling. So this is really the attempt, and some of the examples. The reason I, for instance, sustain hope through all this very dark period that we're going through is because on the ground, they're just amazing initiatives, and I can talk for hours with the stories of these initiatives that I've been to or know of, and these are not necessarily very small. Some of them are large scale. We're talking about 1 million, 2 million, 5 million people. For instance, the Zapatista indigenous autonomy movement in Mexico, where they actually completely govern that whole region themselves through radical direct democracy, through ecological systems of economic production, through women's empowerment and emancipation, and a whole bunch of other things. Or a similar thing happening in the Kurdish movement in Central Asia, in the midst of that war-torn area of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. There is the Kurdish ethnic population with others trying to create a zone of peace based on what they call genealogy or ecofeminist principles, and many others. So these are examples which one can learn from, be inspired by, to say that there is actually hope. It's not in the future. We have these living utopias in a sense right now, and we can learn from them and spread them and connect them.
Nice. So that takes me to another kind of, I do want to now, okay, I think before I go to another side, which is more positive side, I want to look at today. And I don't want to necessarily take names, but I think we are living in a psychosis today where we have bought into a much narrower and monochromatic vision of the now and the future. And that is leading to we almost letting die the diversity of our culture, our intellect, our curiosity, and our even ability to accommodate and build with the richness of our environment. So if you were to, again, without citing names, because I think those names won't exist 20 years from now. So what are the characteristics of today that are hurting ecology and a way of living that you're championing?
Yeah, I mean, I think
And I'm not talking historically,
many,
I'm
but
talking about today now.
sure, yeah. But I mean, I think we, because we're still living in some senses a post-colonial, not the post-colonial, sorry, a neo-colonial world, right? I mean, there's still our imagination. Like one of the favorite exercises I do with young people, especially, is I show a map of the world with names of all these, like Zapatista, Kurdish, alternative movements. But that map is what they would say it's upside down. So it's got Africa on top and Europe below, right? And when I show that, people say, why is this upside down? And then we get into this whole discussion of why the maps we're using right now are actually from the colonial period. And in many, many senses, our minds are actually still colonized. There's no reason for Africa to be below and Europe to be on top. And the sizes are, of course, also distorted in those colonial time maps. Europe is made to look much bigger than it actually is. Whether it's language or it's food or it's imagination, as you're saying, it's even things like what do I think of as human progress? What do I even think of as being a human being? What does it mean? Is it homo materialis, somebody who consumes more and more and more and bigger and faster and faster and faster? Or is it homo socialis, who has good social relations, homo naturalis, who actually has good relations within and understands that as human beings we're part of nature, not separate from it, and so we need to be humble about it. um, that that diversity of imaginations which may have existed, that is now confined to just one thing of what does it mean to be human, or what does it mean to be progressed, what does it mean to be wealthy. Even the way words are homogenized, the word wealthy comes from well-being, but for us wealthy means rich, money rich, monetarily rich, right? So so it is this homogenization or the sort of monocultures, I think Vandana called it the monocultures of the mind, which are what are underlying the destruction of everything that we actually value. And everything we value includes, of course, the rest of nature, but it also includes my independence, my autonomy. Gandhiji called it Swaraj. When he said Swaraj, he was not saying India's independence from the British. He was saying everybody's independence, community's independence, freedom, autonomy, self-determination, but with respect for everybody else's freedom, autonomy, self-respect, etc. So it's not, I can't be riding roughshod over somebody else for my freedoms and my happiness. And this means that you also then respect diversity. You respect somebody else's religion, you respect somebody else's language, you respect somebody else's food, and you exchange all these things. Now, without that kind of uniqueness, diversity, and all, what there would be no beauty left in the world. Imagine just one kind of flower and one kind of food and one McDonald's or whatever, and one language, English dominating everything. It would be just such a boring world. But not just boring; it would be a dangerously vulnerable world. We know, for instance, that biological diversity is the most important reason for nature to be resilient in the face of attacks, crises, in the face of climatic changes. Even farmers are realizing that if I have 10 varieties of a crop, I would be much more resilient to the climate crisis than if I had only one variety. Even if that one variety gave me a lot of production this year, next year it might completely collapse, and then I have nothing left to fall back on. So diversity in that sense is a fulcrum of resilience, sustainability, survival, happiness. And that's what we lose when we have this kind of monocultural mindset.
I like that. So one very, very practical, tangible question I have is, you've been a part of Narmada Bachao Andolan. The vested interests have created a narrative of it as pro versus anti-development, like they've created it around that. But for curious, sensitive people like you and I, whose belief system is different, Narmada Andolan, Narmada itself serves as a metaphor for a much bigger thinking. So my question to you is, your experience, your association, and the actions and ideas that have emerged out of Narmada Andolan, what has What has it taught to you that you would want to carry forward to the next generations? What does Narmada Andolan symbolize? And what are its teachings?
Yeah, this takes me back to 1983 when in college we did a 50-day walk along the river, along the Narmada. It was an adventure, it was learning, it was asking questions of hundreds of people along the way, saying, okay, what does the river mean to you? If these dams are built, what would it mean? And so on. Walking through forests which were going to be submerged if the dams came up. And in 1984, we brought out a report called Narmada Valley Development Project, Development or Destruction. Because this was, I mean, we already had a sense of it a little bit earlier, but this is when it really came home to us that a river of that kind, with that incredible beauty, which is sustaining tens of millions of people and wildlife, of course, once it's dammed, will be a dead river. Is that really development? So what has really stuck in my, and then of course the Andolan started in 1985 in a big way. And I and many others got involved with the Andolan actually very centrally for many years after that. I think there were sort of 2 or 3 things that kind of really stood out and have still stuck with me. One is really this fundamental question: what is development? And I think for young people today, that's really a question to be asked, because they know that they're facing a future of incredible crises. Employment crises, ecological crises, social conflicts, authoritarianism, the lack of ability to even voice one's opinion without being named a seditionist or anti-development or whatever. So this question of what is development has to be very central to anything that any of us is doing, and especially the younger generation. And I'm glad that many of the younger generations are asking, younger people are asking these questions. Second, we got this very strong sense when we were walking along the river that for the people along the river was not a commodity. She was their mother, called Ma Narmada, Ma Reva. And I also remember another movement back in the around the same time in in Gadchiroli in southern Maharashtra, on the Indravati River, where 300 Adivasi villages got together to protest against 2 big dams, Gopalpatnam and Champalli. And in that, they were saying the same thing. They said to the government that for you, the river is a commodity. For us, the river is our mother. And we won't allow our mother to be shackled in the way that you want to, through the dams. So, a different imagination of what nature is, of what a river is, that the river has its own life, the river has its own rights, is something that also we learned from that. And then the third thing is that for the farmers along the river or the Adivasis along the river, their livelihoods were not to be looked down upon. They were saying, if we are farming here and we're sustaining ourselves, this is as dignified as any job that you might have in the city. Why should you look down on farming as a primitive, a backward occupation, or forest, earning a livelihood from the forest as a backward occupation? So there was a certain pride, which unfortunately in most parts of the world has been sort of trodden upon, dumbed down, so that people themselves start saying, oh my God, I have a very backward life. My children at least should become a computer engineer. But there in the movement, they were actually asserting that, no, these are dignified livelihoods and we want to sustain them. We do not want to give them up. So I think these are some of the things that have stayed with us for ever since then. It's now 40 years since we did that trek. To me, my request to all young people would be, get out there and see the world from these perspectives. Visit these areas, visit the movements, be part of them. Go and talk to people living along these rivers or lakes or wetlands or mountains or forests, and get a bit of a different perspective than what textbooks and newspapers might tell you.
Wonderful. We have just 7 more minutes. I have one question which is off the track that I have taken till now. During COVID, a lot of people who had migrated from villages to cities, Bombay, Delhi, so on, they walked back hundreds of miles to their villages. because that's where they felt they were more secure. That was their homeland. There is enough documentation of why they came to the cities and why they stayed there. Are you aware of any work that has been done as to how they have felt coming back to their roots?
Yeah, no. In fact, a lot of people were reporting. We ourselves have about 100 examples of cases, stories from different parts of the world, about 70 from India, of how communities were able to be resilient in the COVID pandemic, including helping migrant labor who had come back to the villages and had nothing to fall back on. So how these communities were either created or already had community funds from the sustainable use of their natural resources, or they had a community spirit, which then made sure that these people were not starving, right? The big challenge for all of these people, so in so many cases, we got these narratives saying that people would not want to come back to the city if they had an option in the villages. If there were livelihoods available, they won't want to come back to the same insecure jobs in the cities. Some of them would, but many of them no. But that was then the big question. Does our development policy actually provide enough inputs to our villages to vitalize them in such a way that in fact people don't have to go out? They might still want to, but they don't have to migrate out. In fact, you might have a reverse migration, and we have many examples where this has happened. um, Anna Sahib Hazare's village Ralegan Siddhi, or there's Kutambakkam near Chennai, or many others, where because the village has got really vitalized, there's good livelihoods available, there's a good schooling option, there are good health options there, people are not moving out. In fact, people have come back who had gone off to the cities. I have met young people in Kutch where handloom weaving has revived. They've actually come back from Tata Adani Industries or from the Gulf to come back to the village and work with their families on making handloom products, right? So this is possible. You actually can reverse or stop this kind of crazy migration that's happening if enough attention is paid to these areas. And if that happens, you won't have this phenomenon of millions and millions and millions of extremely vulnerable casual workers, daily workers, etc., which unfortunately our capitalist system thrives on, but is really a shame for India.
So, last 4 minutes, and I'm going to go into a new space. So, in this new world that we discussed today, the imaginary world that we want all to move towards, it's a more sustainable, harmonious kind of a world. What would progress and prosperity mean, or would they hold any meaning at all?
I think if we are able to revive the meanings of progress and prosperity, rescue them from the financialization and commodification, materialism that has captured them, then yes, absolutely. Great learning opportunities would be a way by which I or my community could progress towards, understanding the world better. Intercultural relationships across the world could help me to become a more holistic human being, to kind of appreciate, love, enjoy other cultures, other languages, songs, etc. So every once in a while I could taste different cuisines. So to me, prosperity or wealth or progress would actually be growth in these aspects of life: the cultural, the social, the ecological aspects of life, not financial. So that actually undermines all of these, and that would be my vision of prosperity.
That's beautiful. I want to share a new realization I've arrived at. Again, coming from my design point of view, I have come to believe that the making of the future must rest on three principles which will drive our future actions: caring, sharing, and co-creating. Mm-hmm. What would be your reaction to that?
No, absolutely. Actually, in the Vikalp Sangam thing, we have what is called the framework notes called In Search of Radical Alternatives, and there's a there's sort of values, ethics, basic ethics and principles that are followed in a lot of the alternative initiatives, and of course more need to be adopted by us. And caring and sharing are very much part of it. Interdependence is very much part of it. Diversity is very much part of it. Creativity is very much part of it. The co-production, I think we've called it, which you're calling co-creation. So really, it's the commons, the collective, spiritual growth, the ability to be within nature, the rights of nature, just like human rights. So there's many of these sort of principles and values, of course, intersecting, which become the foundation of the kind of world that we're living in. And the three
Wonderful.
that you mentioned, absolutely be
Wonderful.
part of it.
Thank you. So yesterday I had a dialogue with Shabnam Hashmi, and she also, like towards the end, when she was talking about what is missing and what we need to reclaim, one thing that she said, besides many other things that really hit me hard, was she said we need to reclaim humor. And I really feel like, I remember when my parents were alive and active, there was a lot of humor in politics also.
True.
And in the discourse, not only the people who are opposed to my beliefs, but even people who are with my belief, we have so much more anger. And we seem to have lost time for humor.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, this is very central. I think we're all living on the edge too much these days. So any word pushes us off and we get angry and we get, upset and all of that. And the ability to make fun of each other and oneself has, I wouldn't say it's died down. There's still elements of it, thank heavens, but it is much less than it used to be. But I mean, on the plus side, we see that in fact, amongst the only expressions of resistance that are still able to survive across the world, including the most authoritarian regimes, are cartoons.
Yes.
And humor. Yeah. So it's not dead, still very much there, and I just hope it comes back.
Yeah, and I'll add one more. I'll add one more thing to this. Last 4 years, I have ventured into writing poetry. For last 1.5 years, I've taken a sabbatical from my work, and I'm traveling around bringing people together for poetry reading sessions. And I'm seeing magical transformations in those group conversations. People pull out their phones and read out poems they've not even told their husbands and wives that they've ever written poems. And what I'm learning from this experience is that besides all the texts, be it Mahabharata or Karl Marx's Das Kapital or whatever it might be, text has a limited value in inspiring imagination, whereas poetry lives deep inside us. And it inspires a very positive, constructive, caring, and compassionate view of possibilities. And so, adding to humor, I want to say we need to bring poetry also into our process of transformation.
I think actually, a couple of years back, a year back, I wrote a modern version of Tagore's "Where the Mind is Without Fear," which starts with the line where Amazon is an endless rainforest, not an endless orgy of shopping, and then goes on in that vein. But so yeah, absolutely. But I'm just so we can expand that to say all the arts, all the creative forms, right? It's like, so there's humor, there's poetry, there's singing, there's music, there's art, there's theater, all of that becomes actually very powerful ways of resisting and of creating these alternative imaginaries. And we need much more of it. I think the ecological and social and human rights movements have done some of it, but much more is needed of all of this. And to also give people a sense that everybody actually can be a poet, or like I said earlier, or an artist, or a musician, or a dancer, or whatever. We don't have to, get stuck in what the schools are telling us.
See, because poetry taps into the poetics of life. And it creates a
Mhm.
certain kind of receptivity, curiosity, and imagination that is in it is inherent harmony,
Hmm.
slowing down, reflection, and contemplation.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think if we are sufficiently tuned to the rest of nature, there's so much poetry there.